The next morning, Rose found Kaelion waiting for her in the training yard, his easy grin firmly in place. Every gesture, every expression that had once seemed natural now looked calculated to her newly opened eyes. "Good morning, Firebrand," he said, his tone light and teasing as if nothing had changed. Rose forced a smile, ignoring the pang in her chest at the sound of his voice, the same voice that had spoken so coldly about controlling her. "Morning," she replied, keeping her tone casual. She had practiced this moment in her mind, determined not to let her mask slip. "Feeling better today?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they made their way toward the sparring grounds. His concern sounded genuine, which only made it hurt more. "Yeah," she said, shrugging with carefully crafted indifference. "Just needed some rest." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Kaelion nodded, his grey eyes scanning her face with an intensity she now recognized as assessment rather than care. "Good. Because I was thinking, after training, we could sneak away and explore the old ruins near the West Wing. I heard there's a hidden passage no one's used in years." Rose hesitated, her stomach twisting. It was exactly the kind of suggestion that once would have made her smile, the promise of shared adventure and stolen moments. Now it felt like another move in a game she didn't fully understand. Still, she nodded, knowing this was her chance to learn more. "Sure. Sounds fun." Kaelion's grin widened, and for a moment, she almost believed it was real. Almost. But she had seen behind the mask now, and there was no going back. The real question was, what was he planning to show her in those ruins, and why? Throughout the day, Rose's resolve wavered like a flame in the wind. Kaelion's charm was as disarming as ever, his concern for her feeling genuine enough to make her heart ache. The way his hand would brush against hers, how his eyes softened when he looked at her. It all felt real, even as she replayed his cold, calculated words in the magisters' private chambers. She hated how much she wanted to trust him, to believe that there was some part of him that wasn't a lie, some fragment of truth in the connection they had shared. But every time doubt crept in, softening her defenses, she reminded herself of what she had heard. If she becomes too unstable, you know what must be done. The words were like ice in her veins, extinguishing any warmth his presence tried to kindle. By the time they reached the ruins that evening, Rose had steeled herself. She played her part perfectly, laughed at his jokes with just the right amount of warmth, leaned into his touch when the chill set in, as if seeking comfort rather than gathering intelligence, and let him believe she was still the same Rose who had kissed him by the fire. Each moment of pretense was both a victory and a wound. But beneath the surface, her fire burned hotter than ever, fueled by betrayal and determination. It waited, like she waited, for the moment she could finally let it loose and show them all exactly what they had created in their attempts to control her. That evening, as the fortress grew quieter and the usual sounds of training and rituals faded into shadows, Rose found Kaelion in the West Wing ruins. He sat on a crumbling stone bench, tossing a small pebble between his hands with practiced ease. When he saw her approach, his grin lit up the dim space like he had been waiting just for her. "You're late," he teased, standing to greet her. The way he moved toward her was familiar, comfortable, a dance she now knew had been choreographed from the start. Rose shrugged, keeping her expression neutral even as her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. "I wasn't sure if you were serious about this little adventure." Each word felt like testing ice, wondering when it would crack. Kaelion chuckled, motioning for her to follow. His confidence was palpable in the small space. "Come on, Firebrand. Have I ever let you down?" Her stomach twisted at the words, bitter irony burning in her throat, but she forced a small smile. Not yet. The double meaning hung in the air between them, though only she could feel its weight. He led her deeper into the ruins, the air growing cooler as they descended into a series of narrow passageways. The torchlight flickered, casting their shadows against the uneven walls like dancing spectres. Rose stayed close, her hand brushing the handle of her whip as she prepared herself, not for a fight, but for the conversation to come. Every step deeper into the ruins felt like walking further into a trap, but this time, she wasn't the one being hunted. After a few minutes, they emerged into a small hidden alcove. The room was barren except for an old, cracked stone table in the center, its surface worn smooth by centuries of forgotten use. Kaelion sat on the edge of the table, patting the spot beside him with that familiar ease that now felt like a weapon. "So what's on your mind?" he asked, his tone casual, practiced. Rose leaned against the table, her posture carefully relaxed even as every nerve screamed with awareness. She needed to steer the conversation carefully to make him think she was confiding in him while planting seeds that might provoke a slip, like a game of chess where only she knew all the pieces. "I've been thinking about the crystal," she said, keeping her voice soft, vulnerable, "about why the magisters wanted it so badly." Kaelion's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders, a tell she might have missed before. "They didn't tell you?" Rose shook her head, feigning frustration. "They never tell me anything. I thought maybe you might know." She let the words hang between them, bait carefully laid. Kaelion hesitated, his grey eyes searching hers with an intensity that once made her heart race. Now she wondered what he was really looking for. "Why does it matter? You got it for them. That's all they care about." Rose tilted her head, letting a note of vulnerability creep into her voice, the perfect mix of uncertainty and trust she knew he expected from her. "It matters to me, Kaelion. I can feel it. What the crystal did to me, how it changed me. Don't you think I deserve to know why they wanted it?" He hesitated again, longer this time, and Rose pushed a little further. "Do you think they'll give it back?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Let me use it again? Or was I just another test for them?" Kaelion's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly, another calculated move in their dance. "You're more than a test, Rose," he said, his tone serious. The words might have warmed her once. "The magisters, they see potential in you, more than they've seen in anyone else. That's why they push you so hard." Rose nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor as though she were processing his words. Inside, her mind raced. His answer was carefully worded, but it still revealed something critical. The magisters weren't just training her, they were testing her limits, pushing her towards something she couldn't yet see. She looked up at him, letting her eyes soften with practiced vulnerability. "You really think they see that in me?" Kaelion smiled, the tension in his expression easing. "I know they do, and so do I." The sincerity in his voice almost made her falter. Almost, but she had learned her lesson about trust, about the pretty lies that hid ugly truths. This time, she would be the one writing the ending to their story. Rose decided to press just a little further, each word carefully chosen. "What about you?" she asked, her tone lighter now, as if the question had just occurred to her. "You've been by my side through everything. Don't you think I deserve a little honesty?" Kaelion's grin faltered for just a heartbeat, but he recovered quickly, too quickly. "What do you mean?" Rose shrugged, keeping her voice casual even as she watched for his tells. "I mean, you seem to know a lot more about the magisters than I do. You're always in their good graces, running errands, delivering reports." She paused deliberately. "What do they tell you about me?" He stiffened, the pebble in his hand stilling as he looked at her. Something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or concern. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said carefully, each word measured. "That's not an answer," Rose said, her smile fading just enough to look genuine. The hurt in her voice wasn't entirely feigned. Kaelion hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as part of his practiced routine. "They just They want to make sure you're staying focused, that you're not getting distracted. Distracted by what? His gaze flicked to her whip, then back to her face. A tell she wouldn't have caught if she hadn't been looking for it. By anything that might compromise your training. Rose's stomach churned at his words, at how easily he wove truth and lies together, but she kept her expression neutral. I see, she said softly. Thanks for being honest with me, Kaelion. He relaxed slightly, his grin returning like a mask sliding back into place. Of course. You know I've got your back. The irony of his words burned in her chest, but she smiled back, playing her part in their elaborate charade. With each lie he told, she was learning more about the truth he tried to hide. As they made their way back to the main fortress, Rose replayed the conversation in her mind, dissecting every word, every pause, every subtle shift in his expression. Kaelion's careful answers had only confirmed what she already suspected. The magisters were using him to monitor her, to ensure her loyalty. His role wasn't just to watch her, it was to shape her, to mold her into whatever the Order wanted her to become. And while she hadn't gotten all the answers she wanted, she had seen something in his hesitation, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. That moment when he'd faltered, when his mask had slipped ever so slightly, told her more than any of his practiced responses. Even the perfect spy could make mistakes. She knew now that Kaelion wasn't as infallible as he seemed. His confidence, his easy charm, his careful manipulation, they were weapons, yes, but weapons that could be turned against him. And the more she learned, the closer she came to turning their game in her favor. Let him think he was the one pulling the strings. She would show them all what happened when you tried to cage fire. Back in her quarters, Rose sat cross-legged on her cot, staring at the flickering candle on the table beside her. The flame danced in rhythm with her thoughts as the conversation with Kaelion replayed in her mind, his careful words and the hesitations that hinted at more than he was willing to admit. They want to make sure you're staying focused, that you're not getting distracted. The words felt hollow now, their true meaning sharp and clear as broken glass. Kaelion knew more, much more, about the Magister's plans for her. He was protecting their secrets, even as he smiled and offered her reassurances that tasted like poison. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her blanket as she exhaled slowly, watching the candle flame waver. If she wanted answers, she would have to take them. Kaelion wasn't like the Magisters, cold and calculating from the start. He was different, charming, reckless, and eager to win her trust. He had opened the door, letting her see a version of him that felt real enough to touch. And now she would use it against him, turn his own weapon back on its wielder. Rose stood, her resolve hardening as she began to pace. The shadows of her movement played across the walls like dancing spectres. She couldn't confront him directly. That would only give him time to cover his tracks and report to the Magisters. Instead, she needed him vulnerable, caught off guard, his defences lowered. Intimacy. The word made her stomach churn, but it was her best option. Kaelion was confident, cocky even, in his ability to manipulate her. If she leaned into that, played into his desire for connection, he might let something slip. The thought of using the same tactics he had used on her left a bitter taste in her mouth, but she pushed aside her revulsion. This wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about survival. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one she had. And perhaps there was a certain justice in using his own game against him. The next evening, Rose sought Kaelion out. She found him in the training yard, his blade flashing in the dim torchlight as he practiced against a wooden dummy. Sweat gleamed on his skin as he moved with practiced grace. He looked up as she approached, a grin spreading across his face, the same grin that once made her heart race. Now nothing but another weapon in their arsenal. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, sheathing his blade with a fluid motion. "What brings you here?" Rose shrugged, letting a faint smile touch her lips. A calculated gesture, just as he had taught her without meaning to. Just needed a distraction. Thought I'd see if you were up for a rematch. Kaelion's grin widened, eager and predatory. Think you can take me this time, Firebrand? Only one way to find out. They sparred for a while, the tension between them easing into something more familiar. Rose let herself relax just enough to keep Kaelion from sensing anything amiss, laughing when he teased her and feigning annoyance when he landed a hit. Each reaction carefully measured, a performance for an audience of one. When they finished, she sat on the edge of the training platform, her chest heaving from exertion. Kaelion joined her, offering her his water flask with that easy intimacy she now knew was rehearsed. "You're getting better," he said, his voice warm with approval that once meant everything to her. Rose took a sip, glancing at him from beneath her lashes. "You think so?" "Definitely." He leaned back on his elbows, his gaze flicking to her with practiced casualness. "But don't get cocky. You're not that good yet." Rose smirked, setting the flask aside. "Maybe I just need better motivation." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Kaelion raised an eyebrow, his grin faltering slightly, a crack in his armor she might have missed before. "Motivation, huh? What kind of motivation are we talking about?" She shrugged, leaning closer, letting him think he was the one in control. "I don't know. Maybe you could give me a few pointers. You seem to know everything else around here." Kaelion laughed, the sound a little too loud as he shifted slightly, nervous energy betrayed by the smallest tells. "What can I say? I'm a man of many talents." Rose tilted her head, her voice softening into something that could be mistaken for affection. "Yeah, you are." Behind her eyes, the fire burned steady and sure. Let him think he was the hunter here. Later that evening, as they sat together in one of the fortress's quieter corners, Rose let the conversation drift into more personal territory. She leaned closer when she laughed, letting her fingers brush against his arm with practiced casualness. She let her guard down, just enough to make him believe she was falling for him all over again, even as each touch felt like handling a poisoned blade. And Kaelion responded exactly as she'd hoped. His grin softened into something warmer, his words losing some of their calculated edge. But Rose caught the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his eyes tracked her movements, still assessing, still measuring. When the conversation turned to the magisters, Rose took her chance, her heart steady despite the risk. "Do you ever get tired of them?" she asked, her voice low, intimate. Kaelion hesitated, his gaze flicking to her. A tell. "The magisters?" "Yeah," she said, leaning against his shoulder, letting him feel her warmth. "They're always watching, always demanding more. Don't you ever feel like they're using us?" Kaelion was silent for a long moment, his expression guarded. The torchlight cast shadows across his face, making his features harder to read. "It's not about us," he said finally. "It's about the bigger picture." Rose tilted her head, her voice soft but probing. "But what's the bigger picture? What are they really trying to do?" Kaelion's jaw tightened, his hesitation palpable. She could almost see him weighing his words. "They want control," he said carefully. "Over you, over the crystal, over everything." Rose's heart raced at this slip, but she kept her voice steady, gentle. "And you?" she asked, her hand resting lightly on his. The touch felt like ice despite its apparent warmth. "What do you want, Kaelion?" He looked at her then, his grey eyes searching hers with an intensity that might once have made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might tell her the truth, might let his mask slip completely. But instead he smiled, his defences rising once more like a shield between them. "I want to keep you safe, Firebrand. That's all." Rose leaned back, her smile faint and knowing. "I hope that's true." The lie hung between them like smoke, visible only to her. As the night wore on and Kaelion eventually left, Rose sat alone in the darkness, replaying the conversation in her mind. The shadows seemed to dance with her thoughts, each one carrying a piece of the puzzle she was slowly assembling. She hadn't gotten everything she wanted, but she had seen the cracks in his armor, tiny fissures that revealed the truth beneath his careful lies. They want control, over you, over the crystal, over everything. The words echoed in her mind, heavy with meaning. It was enough to confirm what she already suspected, and enough to make her realize she couldn't trust anyone but herself. Even now, she could feel the weight of their surveillance, their attempts to shape her into their perfect weapon. Her plan was working. Each careful touch, each calculated vulnerability was bringing her closer to the truth. And soon Kaelion would learn what it meant to be burned by the very fire he thought he could control. The irony would be exquisite. The manipulator becoming the manipulated, the hunter becoming the prey. In the darkness, her smile held no warmth at all. Rose waited until the fortress had settled into its usual eerie stillness, the dim light of the torches casting long shadows across the stone walls. She had planned this carefully, like setting a trap, with 2 small flasks tucked into her cloak. The drink wasn't the cheap bitter brew the magisters rationed out to their servants. It was something better, smoother, stolen from the private stores in the lower halls. Each detail thought out to make him lower his guard. She found Kaelion exactly where she expected him. The training yard, his blade flashing as he practiced in solitude. The moonlight caught his movements, making them seem almost ethereal. He turned at the sound of her approach, his grin appearing instantly. Practiced? Perfect. Twice in 2 nights, he teased, sheathing his blade with fluid grace. People might start to think you like me. Rose rolled her eyes, pulling one of the flasks from her cloak and tossing it to him. The gesture casual, calculated. Don't let it go to your head. Kaelion caught the flask with ease, his eyebrows raising in surprise, his guard slipping just slightly. What's this? A distraction, she said, sitting on the edge of the platform. The word carried more meaning than he knew. Thought we could both use one. Kaelion joined her, uncapping the flask and taking a cautious sip. His grin widened, pleasure replacing suspicion. This isn't the swill they give us in the mess hall. Where'd you get it? Rose shrugged, taking a sip from her own flask. The liquid burned less than the lies on her tongue. Let's just say I have my ways. He laughed, leaning back on his elbows, his posture relaxed just as she'd planned. Colour me impressed. Behind her answering smile, Rose's mind was sharp and focused. The game was just beginning. They sat together as the night deepened, the flasks growing lighter and the conversation growing looser. Rose let Kaelion steer the conversation at first, laughing at his jokes and matching his easy banter. Each response was calculated, even as she appeared to relax into the moment. But as the alcohol began to soften his sharp edges, dulling that ever-present awareness in his eyes, she started to guide the conversation, subtly steering it toward the magisters and the crystal, like a hunter leading prey into a trap. You ever wonder why they're so obsessed with the crystal? She asked, keeping her tone casual, almost drowsy. Kaelion tilted his head, his grey eyes narrowing slightly, a flash of awareness through the haze. Why do you ask? Rose shrugged, taking another sip. The liquid burned less than the lies. I mean, they sent us halfway across the umbral realm to get it. You'd think they'd at least let me know why it's so important. Kaelion chuckled, though the sound was strained. His mask slipping just slightly. You know how they are. Everything's on a need-to-know basis, and they think we don't need to know much. Rose leaned closer, her voice dropping slightly intimate. But you do, don't you? They trust you more than they trust me. Kaelion hesitated, the flask pausing halfway to his lips. She watched the internal struggle play across his features. What makes you think that? Come on, Rose said, her tone light but probing. She let her shoulder brush against his. You're always meeting with them, always running errands. They must tell you something. Kaelion took a long drink. his gaze drifting toward the flickering torchlight. The silence stretched between them. "They're careful," he said finally. "But yeah, I pick up things here and there." Rose tilted her head, feigning curiosity while her heart raced. "Like what?" Kaelion hesitated again, his tongue loosening but his instincts still holding him back. She could almost see the war behind his eyes. "They're just testing you," he said carefully. "The crystal changed you and they want to see how far they can push you." Her heart tightened at the confirmation, but she kept her expression neutral, interested. "Push me how?" Kaelion sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. The gesture seemed almost genuine. Almost. "They think you're strong, stronger than anyone else, but they're also afraid of what you might do if you ever turned against them." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Rose felt the truth of them settle into her bones, even as she maintained her facade of innocent curiosity. They were afraid of her power, as they should be. Rose's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her tone even, masking the storm building inside her. "Turn against them? Why would I do that?" Kaelion shook his head, his smile faltering. The alcohol had loosened his tongue just enough to let truth seep through the cracks. "It's not about what you do. It's about what you could do. The crystal didn't just make you stronger, it made you dangerous." Rose leaned back slightly, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped thing. "And that's why they sent you to watch me, isn't it?" Kaelion stiffened, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second before he recovered. That brief flash of panic in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "Rose." "It's okay," she said quickly, forcing a laugh that felt like swallowing glass. "I get it. They don't trust me, so they send the charming rogue to keep an eye on me. It's actually kind of flattering, in a way." The words tasted like poison. Kaelion's smile returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He was scrambling now, trying to repair the damage. "You're overthinking it, Firebrand. I'm here because I want to be." Rose took another sip of her drink, hiding the anger that burned just beneath her skin. Every fibre of her being wanted to confront him, to make him admit the full extent of his betrayal. Instead, she smiled, soft and dangerous. "Good to know," she said softly, her voice laced with something Kaelion might mistake for gratitude. But beneath it lay a promise, one he was too blind to see. When the night finally ended and Kaelion left, Rose sat alone by the dying fire, her mind racing. His words had given her just enough to confirm her suspicions. The magisters didn't just see her as a weapon, they saw her as a threat. A fire they thought they could contain. And Kaelion, for all his charm and warmth, for all his tender touches and gentle words, was just another leash they had placed around her neck. But she wouldn't let them win. Not this time. She had played her part perfectly, luring Kaelion closer with calculated vulnerability, pulling just enough information from him without tipping her hand. Every laugh, every touch, every seemingly innocent question had been another thread in the web she was weaving, and next time she would push further, dig deeper into the cracks she'd found in his armor. For now, she let herself smile faintly, the firelight casting a flickering glow across her face. Let them think she was still the naive girl they could control. Let Kaelion believe his manipulation was working, that she was falling deeper under his spell. When the time came, they would see just how dangerous she could be. And by then, it would be too late. "Oh, you've found your way here, have you? Curious about what's next?" Pauses. "Good, because there's plenty more where this came from."
If you want to stay in the know, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications, unless of course you enjoy surprises. But something tells me you don't like being left in the dark. Go on, make sure you don't miss a thing, because once you're here, Whispers, there's no turning back.